Welcome to another episode of The Consulting Curve, the community approach to clients and consulting. Brought to you each week by BizDrivers.biz, founded by Peter Selby, a trusted profit and growth advisory to companies and consultants around the world. Tune in each week and learn how you can take that journey from corporate to consulting. With another episode of The Consulting Curve with my good friend Peter Selby. Peter, thanks for joining us again.
Pleasure as always, Kevin. Pleasure.
To lay the groundwork, what we've covered so far is we actually covered the first driver in the learning curve of consulting, and that driver was the sales conversion driver. We broke it down into three parts in episodes 2, 3, and 4 that we did, and then we kind of rounded that first section off with a great interview with Brendan O'Keefe, but you and Brendan set a great stage as we kind of segue into the second driver that we want to start talking about this week, in the client value drivers. And we really want to drill down in just what does it mean to position value or value positioning in consulting. So Peter, anything that came to mind from the first few episodes that you just wanted to kind of recap as we kind of lay a foundation for this next section?
Sure. Look, if you think about the elements of converting opportunities, one of the things we talked about there was the sales closure code and how you get to rapid business decisions through bringing clarity and positioning yourself, I guess, uniquely. We're going to talk about that in a bit more depth right now, but it connects very much with the driving of converting sales. So at the end of the day, if you can't position your value to a customer, you're going to struggle to close a sale at all. So whilst that we talked about a lot of things that go around systemizing your approach to the market and marketing yourself and positioning, the next bit is about the first part of the assignment, which is positioning from the client's perspective. So they are connected, I guess, quite closely. And it was interesting to hear Brendan's view of pulling all that together, and how he's moved from the world of an unhappy world of employment into consulting, but had to pull all these elements to get it off the ground, and his learning curve, his consulting curve is pretty steep right now as he, but it's success that's driving the steepness of that curve. So it's a good story from that perspective.
The one thing that really stuck out to me as we were talking to Brendan was, there were times during the chat that he just kind of, he had that faraway glance that he's like, I can't believe how well this is working. I can't believe how well the pieces are actually fitting together. And he's putting together not only the training that you've given him, but the years of experience that he brought to the table. He's seeing all of these kind of fit together in this, really interesting mosaic. And I'll be anxious to see the other special guests that we have on later in the series. But yeah, let's drill down a little bit just on value positioning. So just define that if you haven't already, and just kind of lay that systemic foundation. And then let's talk about some of the finer points under that.
Well, I guess the first thing to think about from a consulting perspective, or really providing any professional service in a business-to-business environment, is the element of trust. And it's often overlooked a little bit, and especially in consulting, there is a low level of trust in the industry, and that's triggered from the perception around consulting that is often comes from the behavior or the perceived behavior of the very large consulting houses. There's the top 10 sort of consulting houses around the world, maybe perceived as being a bit expensive and unclear about the path and all that sort of stuff. And whilst that might appear to be the case from the outside, they're normally homing in on very specific things or running very large agendas in corporations. So there is an outside perception that's not necessarily reflecting what's going on, but nonetheless, that's left this taste in the market generally that there is a low level of trust, and the initial building a relationship with somebody who's obviously thinking they can help you in some way from a consulting perspective And there are two levels of trust that need to be fulfilled to be engaged as a consultant. People need to be able to trust you at a personal level. And they also need to be able to trust that you can solve their problem. And if you don't tick both of those boxes, the engagement won't happen, no matter how well you know somebody, by the way. So another thing that we often see people tripping up with is, oh, they know X, Y, Z really well. They've been working with that individual for a number of years. We go out and have beers together, or we go out, we're friends beyond work. So he's bound to hire me, or she's bound to hire me. But in actual fact, that person his well-being and his or her salary is connected to outputs in their job. And they're not going to put that at risk, no matter how deep the relationship, if they don't feel they have absolute confidence you can solve their problem. So those two boxes have to be ticked. And equally, if they think that what you're talking about makes so much sense and it's the best approach that anyone's ever heard of, if they don't trust you at a personal level, they're still not going to proceed. So it's something to understand that just naturally, as a consultant, you're starting from a very low point, low level of trust, just because the industry, there's this background feeling, geez, if I hire this consultant, it's going to be like flicking off flies. I'll never get rid of them when they get here. They're going to try and stay around for as long as, all these doubts are in people's minds before you've even opened your mouth, So that's just to understand you're starting from that point. So therefore, to be able to position a solution, you need to have identified the problem. And we talked about that in the conversion code. If you're not identifying the customer's needs and understanding those, and the frame is around their needs, not your solution, then that has to be the starting point. And if you've got to a position where the customer has agreed with you what the problem is, and you can frame that in a way that is clear, then your solution needs to be equally clear. And they need to be able to see every element of your solution and the benefit at each step of that solution. And quite often we see people positioning where, well, we're going to solve this business issue, and this is the price for solving that issue. And there isn't absolute clarity about the journey from where you are now to what the world looks like when that problem's solved, how long it's going to take, what are the benefits at each point, and all of that stuff. So that needs absolute clarity, because you have to remove the risk. At the end of the day, change. Sorry?
Well, isn't it both kind of a two-sided marketplace, though? I mean, doesn't the client also have to understand, or clearly be able to articulate, what their need is? And if it always goes back to trust. I mean, everything kind of leads back to trust. I trust you. You said I have to trust you, but I also have to trust that you can deliver the solution. But I also have to understand what I need to be solved, on my side.
Absolutely. You've got to have trust that the solution is going to solve the problem that you've identified. Totally. And you haven't clearly identified the problem, it's impossible to position a clear solution. Totally impossible. So those two things do go hand in hand. And the business benefit needs to be very clear.
Right.
I mean, as a professional service provider, you're only doing one thing, you're selling money. It doesn't matter. Everyone, a common thing we see is people fall in love or get fixed on their solution. The client actually doesn't care about your solution. And that's one thing to remember. They do not care about your solution. They care about fixing their problem. And their problem, it's a bit like music being the universal language. The other universal language is money. Every business runs on it one way or another. It's either generating more revenue from a sales perspective, or it's delivering more profit to the bottom line through better business processes, or reducing risk through good advice or legal advice, or whatever it may be. So at the end of the day, if you really want to boil down positioning to its most simplest elements, the client is always buying trust, and you are always selling money one way or another. It's that simple.
I got a funny story. I actually was on a plane this week, and I was sitting beside a young man who had his laptop out, and we were just kind of, doing kind of the quick chat about, how life is going. And I said, what are you working on? He said, I'm working on my resume, or as you would say, your CV. And I said, really? I said, so what do you want to do? And he said, well, he said, I was a physics major in university, but I think I want to start with consulting. And I almost started laughing out loud. I thought about you on the plane, and I'm thinking, so this kid is a physics major. He would like to go to, to med school, but in the interim, I'm just going to kind of fill time with a job that kind of pays the bills. So he was looking at the big firms that you mentioned or that we talked about earlier, and I'm thinking that would not instill trust in me as a client if I had somebody that was literally just there. It's just a stopgap, in their it's just another stop in their resume journey, on to something else. And it was just funny that I saw that sitting beside him, thinking how different that is from what you've described, the process that you try to go through with biz drivers.
That's a really interesting point. When we're trying to understand whether we're a good fit to help somebody, if from the consulting side of the business that we have, I mean from advising consultants rather than companies. One of the things that stops us progressing somebody is their reason for doing it. And if they are, hey, I'm trying to get a job, but I'm struggling to get one, so I'm going to go consultant for a while to pay the bills. You can never actually be a very good consultant. I mean, you're half doing something while you've got your eye over your shoulder looking for a job. You need to commit to either getting a job or commit to a career or whatever it may be in providing guidance for others. But it is a profession nonetheless, and you can't sort of do it at a whim or do it until I can find something better. It would be a bit like turning up for a job interview and saying, yeah, you want the job, but really I only want the job until I find something better. That's going to come out in your demeanor in the interview and you won't get the job. So it's a similar thing, right? So clients pick up on all this stuff. I mean, and it's a hard existence from a point of view. I don't mean it's hard to eke out a living. What I mean is you've got to be committed as much as anything else. So if you don't have the disposition that you're really driven by trying to help people, it shows. Clients pick it up on it, and that comes down to that personal
Absolutely.
trust.
Absolutely. You mentioned a little earlier about clarity, and I think I actually wrote down in my notes. I said this consulting is a profession. It's a vocation. It's not just a job. You need to look at it that way. But you in the process of consulting well or advising well, you mentioned you've got to bring clarity to a solution, but it's just not clarity in kind of an overarching umbrella fashion. It's not just clarity at a certain point in the process. It's clarity throughout the entire process. Can you unpack that just a little bit?
Sure. So look, from a positioning perspective, right from the first conversation with a customer, you are there to really understand the world from their perspective before you can think about whether you can help them or not. And you may or may not be able to help them. And that really does depend on the capability, the tools, and the expertise you have access to versus the problem they're trying to solve. But in the process of understanding that problem, the client is also understanding the problem. They don't have the problem completely nailed, and unless it's something very, very niche and very specific. We need this new electronic control, and you go to a consultant that can provide that. That's a little bit different. But generally speaking, when you're talking to consultants about trying to run a better business, it's very difficult for a customer to have absolute clarity about what the problem is and what's driving that problem. And often part of the consulting journey after engagement is still a deeper exploratory to understand all the connecting issues. So it isn't very clear for the customer. It's very difficult for them to understand what the problem is. And part of your job at the engagement stage isn't just trying to sell, because you won't get a sale if that's all you're trying to do. And nor should you, by the way. you are trying to understand deeply what the customer's problem is, help them understand what the problem is, and then together work out whether you are the solution to that problem. So this positioning of your solution has to bring a deeper level of clarity than the customer had before he started talking to you. Just from two reasons. One, for the client to be absolutely sure that you are the right fit to solve the problem. And secondly, for you to be sure that you can solve it. And there'd be nothing worse than saying you can solve a problem and then you're not able to solve it. I mean, consultants that work like that don't last very long generally, because the reputation doesn't take long to get around, right? So, you are protecting your professionalism along the way by ensuring you can solve the problem. But equally, the client is convinced 100% that you can solve the problem and that you're the right person for it. That has to be part of the process.
And I think that also it reduces the risk that they perceive, in that process, as you're clear about the benefits, at each stage, and clear that the solution that you're providing, you want them to understand the process and be transparent, in that process. But it's interesting.
Well, that's a really good. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Sorry. There's a delay on this.
Yeah.
That's a really good point, because don't forget, the person that you are talking to is either likely going to be an executive who has their outcomes and their job security around business outcomes, right? They're going to be decision makers of some kind, or they're going to be owners of a business. Either way, they are letting you play with their business. They're letting you change levers in their business. And that has the potential to put their survival one way or the other at risk. So they need to be absolutely convinced that you can solve this problem, what the benefits are at each step along the way. How are they going to know that they've reached that benefit? How do they know it's you that's the right person, or you are the right company as a consulting company to solve that problem? They have to be convinced of all those things. Else the engagement is going to be problematic at best,
Well, as you mentioned in this first section, kind of in the whole client value drivers that we're talking about in this next few episodes, and you wrapped it up well with you got to build trust to position yourself as a person or a solution of value. You've got to articulate clarity. You've got to articulate the benefits. You've got to articulate transparency, articulate professionalism, that you've mentioned. And that also lends itself to the industry as a whole. You don't want to be perceived as ambulance chasers. You don't want to be perceived as people that just have a job. You want to be perceived as professionals in a professional environment. And I love the way that you kind of frame that. The first few weeks we talked about, every week we talk about the importance of doing this job well, or this vocation well. Wrap us up today, Peter, in this section, and we'll kind of lay the groundwork for next week.
Sure. So look, if you think of positioning your value, that is a journey in itself for the customer. Just like delivering your solution is a journey for the customer. The business improvement is a journey for the customer. The positioning is also a journey. You have to take the customer on a journey from when you first talk to each other to when you are engaged. That is a journey that needs to have a system around it, needs to have a process, needs to feel like a journey for the customer, needs to have some visual frames to it. There's lots of things it needs to do, but it is a journey all of its own. And I think if you can get that right, it is whether you can get it right or not, it's a critical element of the link between converting an opportunity and starting to deliver your services.
Well, next week I'm looking forward to delving into just taking a little bit of a pivot here in some of the topics we talked about, and we get into delivering the solution through data and technology. I cannot wait to dive into that, and I'll probably have to look stuff up on Google after we talk about it just to make sure I understand.
I guess the point it's going to make is about the fact that there are some technologies now that are an essential part of consulting wise. That's probably changed in the last decade, But,
Well, we're going to cover it well. Well, Peter, thanks again for taking time today and just
Right.
talking about the consulting curve, the community approach to clients and consulting. We just encourage you to join us every couple of weeks on this great podcast. And thanks again, Peter.
Thank you.